The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of papers. A black family sat at the plaintiff's table, their faces tense but determined. They were here to fight for justice, but they knew the battle wouldn't be easy. Across from them sat Mr. Peterson, a well-known lawyer with decades of experience. He was respected in the legal world, but his reputation carried a darker side. Many believed he had a habit of twisting the truth, especially when representing clients against minorities. This case was no different. The family was suing a wealthy businessman who had wronged them. It could be a stolen property dispute, an unfair business deal, or even a false accusation. Whatever the reason, they had enough evidence to prove their case. But Peterson had other plans. The family's lawyer, Miss Carter, was younger and less experienced, but she was sharp. She had seen lawyers like Peterson before. He used intimidation, confusing legal jargon, and underhanded tactics to break his opponents. But she wasn't going to let that happen today. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. He was an older man with a strong presence, known for his fairness. As everyone took their seats, the judge adjusted his glasses and looked at the lawyers. "Let's begin," he said firmly. The trial had started. The black family braced themselves, knowing they were up against a system that wasn't always on their side. But they had truth on their side, and that was more powerful than any trick Mr. Peterson could pull. Mr. Peterson stood up with a confident smirk. He buttoned his expensive suit and stepped forward, glancing at the jury before speaking. His voice was smooth, calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case isn't as simple as my opposing counsel would have you believe." He walked slowly, making sure everyone was paying attention. Then he turned toward the black family and let out a small sigh. "The plaintiffs claim they were wronged, but let's look at the facts," he continued. "Their business dealings have been questionable. Their records, incomplete. Their understanding of contracts, well, let's just say mistakes were made." Miss Carter immediately objected. "Your Honor, opposing counsel is making misleading statements." The judge looked at Peterson. "Stick to the case, Mr. Peterson." Peterson held up his hands in mock innocence. "Of course, Your Honor. I only wish to ensure the jury sees the full picture." He turned back to the jury, lowering his voice as if he was revealing a secret. "I'm not saying they are dishonest people. I'm simply pointing out that there may have been misunderstandings, mismanagement, perhaps even negligence." The father of the family clenched his fists. He wanted to speak, but Miss Carter placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to stay calm. She had seen this tactic before. Peterson wasn't attacking with facts, he was planting doubt. Peterson then pulled out a document and waved it in the air. "This contract," he said, "was signed by the plaintiffs. And yet, here they are today, pretending they had no idea what they agreed to." He walked back to his seat, smiling. "Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot ignore the possibility that this case is nothing more than an attempt to shift blame." The family exchanged worried glances. Peterson had laid the groundwork for his manipulation. But Miss Carter wasn't going to let him control the narrative for long. Mr. Peterson adjusted his tie and walked toward the witness stand. His tone became softer, but his words carried a sharp edge. He turned to the father first. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "you're a hard-working man, aren't you?" Mr. Ty Johnson nodded cautiously. "Yes, I am." Peterson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course. But tell me, have you ever struggled with finances?" Mr. Johnson hesitated. "Everyone faces struggles at some point." Peterson nodded as if he agreed. "That's understandable. In fact, you've had money problems in the past, haven't you? Loans, overdue bills. Isn't it possible that this case is simply an attempt to fix your own mistakes?" Miss Carter stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor, irrelevant and misleading." The judge frowned. "Sustained. Move on, Mr. Peterson." But Peterson had already planted the seed of doubt. He turned to Mrs. Johnson. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "you're a devoted mother, correct?" She lifted her chin. "Yes, I am." "And you handle most of the family's paperwork?" "Yes," he raised an eyebrow. "And yet, in this legal dispute you claim you didn't realize certain terms in the contract. Wouldn't a responsible mother double-check such important details?" Mrs. Maul Johnson's hands tightened in her lap. "I trusted that we were being treated fairly." Peterson nodded again, then turned to the jury, shaking his head slightly. "Trust is a beautiful thing, but it doesn't change the facts. Perhaps this family wasn't tricked at all. Perhaps they simply made a mistake and now want someone else to pay for it. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The Johnsons felt the weight of Peterson's words pressing down on them. Miss Carter, however, remained calm. She knew exactly what he was doing, trying to weaken them emotionally. But she also knew something Peterson didn't. He was underestimating her. And soon, he would regret it. Miss Carter stood up, her expression steady. She walked toward the jury, letting a brief silence settle in the room. Then she spoke, her voice clear and firm. "Mr. Peterson has done an excellent job of trying to confuse you," she said, glancing in his direction. "But let's focus on what really matters. The truth." She turned to Mr. Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, you've worked in your community for over 20 years, correct?" "Yes," he said. "You've built your business from the ground up?" "That's right," she nodded and faced the jury. "And yet opposing counsel wants you to believe that this man, who has worked hard his entire life, would suddenly try to manipulate the legal system for money." She walked toward the evidence table and picked up a stack of documents. "These are financial records, business agreements, and emails between Mr. Johnson and the defendant. They show a pattern of deception, not from Mr. Johnson but from the other side." She turned back to the jury. "The truth is simple. This family wasn't careless, they weren't negligent, they were misled." Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Objection, Your Honor, that's speculation." Miss Carter smiled slightly. "Not at all, because I have a witness." The judge looked at her. "Proceed." She motioned toward the back of the courtroom. A man stood up, an ex-employee of the defendant. He walked to the stand and took an oath. Miss Carter stepped forward. "Can you tell the court what you saw?" The man hesitated, then spoke. "I worked for the defendant for 5 years. I saw how he handled contracts. He would leave out details and let people sign without fully explaining everything. And I know for a fact he did that to Mr. Johnson." A hush fell over the courtroom. Miss Carter turned to the jury. "This case isn't about a misunderstanding. It's about deception, and the evidence proves it." Mr. Peterson shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping. The balance of power had started to shift. The courtroom was tense. Mr. Peterson's usual smirk had faded, replaced by a stiff expression. He knew things weren't going his way, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. He stood up, adjusting his suit. "Your Honor," he said, forcing a calm tone, "this so-called witness has no real proof. He's simply making accusations. This is hearsay." Miss Carter immediately responded. "Your Honor, the witness worked for the defendant for 5 years. His testimony supports the financial records we've submitted. This isn't hearsay. This is a pattern of dishonesty." The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "I'll be the one to decide that, Mr. Peterson." Mr. Peterson opened his mouth, but the judge raised a hand. "I've allowed you to speak freely in this courtroom, but I will not allow manipulation." The jury sat up straighter. The judge continued, his voice firm. "I've watched you twist facts and attack this family's character instead of focusing on the case. That ends now." Peterson forced a chuckle. "Your Honor, I was simply doing my job." The judge's gaze hardened. "Your job is to present the truth, not distort it." Peterson looked around the courtroom, searching for support, but the energy had shifted. The jury wasn't buying his tactics anymore. The judge turned to Miss Carter. "Continue." She nodded and held up another document. "This is an email from the defendant to Mr. Johnson. In it, he reassures him that everything in the contract is fair and simple. But in reality, he left out crucial terms that benefited only him." She walked toward the jury. "This family wasn't careless. They were misled. And now, Mr. That Peterson wants you to believe they are the ones at fault." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Peterson, do you have any legitimate counter-evidence, or are we done with these distractions?" For the first time, Peterson had no response. The courtroom was no longer under his control. Mr. Peterson shifted in his seat, his confidence cracking. He had spent years using the same tactics, twisting facts, manipulating emotions, and making his opponents look incompetent. But this time, it wasn't working. Still, he wasn't ready to lose. He took a deep breath, stood up, and grabbed a folder from his briefcase. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth again, "I have new evidence that will prove my client acted in good faith." Miss Carter narrowed her eyes. She had dealt with lawyers like Peterson before. When backed into a corner, they always tried one last trick. Peterson walked to the evidence table and held up a document. "This," he announced, is a signed agreement between Mr. Johnson and my client. It clearly states that all terms were explained and agreed upon." He handed it to the judge, who studied it carefully. The courtroom was silent. Then Miss Carter stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'd like to inspect that document." The judge handed it over. Miss Carter examined it, flipping through the pages. Then, a small smile played on her lips. She turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this document is a fake." Gasps filled the room. Peterson's face paled. "Objection, that's an outrageous claim." Miss Carter held up 2 papers side by side. "This is the original contract Mr. Johnson signed, and this is the one Mr. Peterson just submitted. Notice the signature?" She pointed at the name at the bottom. "It looks identical. Too identical." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request an expert to examine this document, but I can already tell you, it's been copied and pasted from the original. The defendant altered the contract to cover his deception." The judge's expression darkened. "Mr. Peterson, do you have an explanation for this?" Peterson opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing to say. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The jury's faces were set in stone. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Mr. Peterson. His usual arrogance had vanished. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the table. He knew he had lost. The judge exhaled sharply. "Mr. Peterson, presenting altered documents is a serious offense. This court does not tolerate dishonesty." Miss Carter remained composed, but inside she felt a wave of satisfaction. Justice was finally within reach. She turned to the jury. "You have seen the truth. This family was deceived. They were taken advantage of, but today they stand before you, asking for what is rightfully theirs." The jury members exchanged looks. They had all the evidence they needed. The judge tapped his gavel. "The court will take a short recess before proceeding with the verdict." Mr. Johnson let out a deep breath. His wife reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. For the first time in weeks, they felt hope. And as Mr. Peterson slumped in his chair, defeated, one thing was clear. His manipulations had finally come to an end.